Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're heading somewhere a little damp, a little smoky, and definitely haunted by the smell of cheap ale and questionable theology. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, pull up a blanket, and let's drift into the strange little corner of history where people were literally paid to eat the dead's mistakes. Yes, that was a real job. Someone had to do it, and that someone was called a sin eater. Setting the scene, picture this. It's late evening in a tiny Welsh village, somewhere around the 1600s. Rain tapping on a thatched roof, a candle flickering in a pewter holder that's seen better days. Inside, the local baker, who also happens to double as the village drunk and part-time gravedigger, gets a knock on his door. He already knows what it means. Another one's died. And the family? Well, they need a sin eater. He sighs, grabs a piece of stale bread and maybe a mug of weak cider, wraps his cloak and trudges through the mud to earn his few pennies. Because really, what else is he going to do? The market won't take bread that tastes like damp ash, and someone's got to feed the children. So he walks to the cottage of the newly deceased, stands by the cold body, mumbles a few words, and eats bread, salt, maybe a sip of ale. Symbolic, but also literal. He takes in the sins of the departed, so their soul can be light enough to float up instead of, going downstairs. That, at least, was the idea. Where did this come from? Now, sin eating isn't something the church exactly approved of. In fact, it sits somewhere between completely heretical and, please stop doing that immediately. But people kept doing it anyway. Because religion, in medieval Europe, wasn't always neat and organized. It was messy, practical, and full of side hustles. If the priest was too busy, or the dying person couldn't confess before they croaked, the community found a workaround. And that workaround involved a poor, slightly tipsy man pretending to absorb spiritual pollution like some kind of medieval sponge. No one knows precisely when it started. Some say it traces back to ancient pagan rites. Those old harvest and blood kind of ceremonies where people symbolically transferred guilt to an animal, or even a loaf of bread. Others say it evolved naturally in places where priests were scarce and sin was plentiful. So, really, Britain, the ritual, in slow motion, the body would be laid out on a board or a table, usually in the front room, since there wasn't much else of a house. A slice of bread was placed on the chest of the deceased, sometimes sprinkled with salt. Beside it, a small bowl of ale or wine. The sin eater would enter, uninvited but expected, and stand silently for a moment. Then he'd mutter a formula. Accounts vary, but one old rhyme went something like, "I give ease to thy soul, my friend. May all thy sins be taken and mine to mend." Not exactly Shakespeare, but it got the job done. He'd then eat the bread, drink the ale, maybe cross himself if he remembered how, and leave without looking anyone in the eye. Payment. A few pence, sometimes a meal, occasionally a blessing. Though no one really wanted to bless him. Because here's the thing. Sin eaters were necessary, but absolutely despised. People wanted their services, but also thought they were walking dumpsters full of other people's spiritual garbage. The village outcast imagined trying to socialize after that. You show up at the tavern, order a pint, and someone whispers, "There he is, the one who ate old Marjorie's envy last week." Awkward. Sin eaters were tolerated, not respected. They lived on the edges of town, sometimes literally in shacks near the churchyard. They were thought to be cursed, since they carried the burden of dozens, maybe hundreds of souls. And yet, when death came, everyone called them. Because hypocrisy is older than bread. Families didn't want Uncle Thomas to wander in purgatory, so they'd quietly hire the local sin eater, then loudly tell the priest they definitely didn't. Double standards were basically the oxygen of medieval Christianity. A curious contradiction, you might wonder. Why would anyone take this job if everyone hated them for it? Money, sure, but also, maybe a bit of self-importance. When you live at the bottom of the social pile, even cursed power feels like power. You might be poor, but you're spiritually essential. Without you, the whole salvation system collapses. The sin eater knew that, and maybe deep down he thought he was doing something good, or at least something necessary. Still, the church was not thrilled. Local clergy often condemned the practice as superstition, calling it heathenism dressed up as charity. And they weren't entirely wrong. Sin eating was messy theology. Half pagan, half Christian, mostly desperate. But when your neighbors are dying from plague and confession lines are long, you improvise. Let's float back a bit further. To really understand it, we should drift back a few centuries earlier. before sin-eating had a name. In the early Middle Ages, people obsessed over what happened after death. You weren't just gone. You were somewhere, waiting for judgment. And that waiting room? Purgatory. Essentially divine customs control. If you died with unpaid spiritual taxes, you stayed there until someone prayed, fasted, or donated enough to get you through. That's where indulgences came from. And that's also why people left money to the church in their wills, to speed up the paperwork of eternity. But what if you were too poor for indulgences? No fancy priests, no golden candles? Enter the sin-eater, a low-budget spiritual solution. Think of him as the medieval equivalent of clicking skip ad on purgatory. Cheap, sketchy, but efficient. Regional flavors of sin, though most documented sin-eating took place in Wales, the English border counties, and some Scottish regions. Similar customs popped up elsewhere. In parts of Germany, mourners would pass bread and beer around the coffin, symbolic of absorbing communal guilt. In Poland, there were soul meals served after funerals. And in the Basque country, people left food for wandering spirits. Different branding, same idea. Food as a medium for sin transfer. Apparently, guilt travels best by carbohydrates. Enter the records. Our first clear written accounts appear around the 17th century. One from 1686 describes a man in Hereford called the last sin-eater of the parish. He'd been seen eating bread off corpses for years, until the local clergy finally cracked down. The writer described him as a lean, hollow-eyed wretch, which honestly sounds like every philosophy student I've ever met. He lived alone, refused to attend church, and when he died, no one wanted to bury him in consecrated ground. Because apparently, even in death, he was too spiritually radioactive. Food and guilt, a timeless combo. The symbolism makes a weird kind of sense, though. Across cultures, food and morality are intertwined. Eating can be sacred or sinful. In the Bible, the whole human downfall started with a snack. So the sin-eater's meal turned that logic upside down. Instead of sin entering the world through food, he was taking it out through food. A spiritual cleanup job. Of course, nobody thought too hard about what happened to him afterward. Where did all that absorbed sin go? Was there a disposal process? A metaphysical compost heap? Nope. He just carried it. Forever. That's a heavy diet. How it looked to the church. The clergy viewed sin-eating as, at best, folk nonsense, and at worst, devil's work. Because if some random villager could forgive sins with bread and ale, what was the priest even for? It undermined authority, and medieval institutions really hated that. You could burn a village and get a pardon, but heaven forbid you freelance in absolution. So, over time, priests tried to suppress the practice. They preached sermons against it, shamed families who hired sin-eaters, and replaced the ritual with official prayers. But sin-eating survived in secret, because death never waits for paperwork. Folk memory and fear even after the Reformation. When England and Wales split from Rome, sin-eaters kept working quietly. Now, instead of being called heretics, they were just superstitious. Same social isolation, new branding. By the 18th and 19th centuries, they became curiosities, rural relics that folklorists loved to write about. Tourists even sought them out, treating them like living ghost stories. Nothing says authentic countryside. Experience like watching a man eat bread over a corpse. One Victorian traveler described meeting a sin-eater in the Welsh hills who claimed he'd eaten more souls than he could count. When asked how he felt, he reportedly said, "Heavy," which honestly, fair. Moral outsourcing. There's something strangely modern about it, though. The whole system is basically spiritual outsourcing. Don't want to feel guilty? Pay someone else to handle it. We still kind of do that today, just with better marketing. Carbon offsets, confession apps, public apologies written by PR teams. Different sins, same instinct. Maybe that's why sin-eaters feel familiar. They were society's scapegoats. People hired to carry guilt so everyone else could sleep at night. And isn't that a little relatable? Let's drift toward the decline. By the late 1800s, the industrial world was less into mystical bread rituals. Urbanization, secularism, and public health reforms didn't really pair well with corpse-side snacking. Also refrigeration. That helped, but traces of the idea survived in folklore, and even in literature. Poets romanticized sin-eaters as tragic figures, lonely saviors misunderstood by the world. Because, of course they did. Victorians could turn a sewage worker into a symbol of divine suffering if you gave them a quill and a thunderstorm. Still, by around 1900, the last supposed sin-eaters had vanished. Or at least gone underground. And honestly, if you're going to vanish, underground seems thematically appropriate. What we'll explore next, in the next stretch, we'll wander deeper into the psychology behind it, how guilt, religion, and poverty created a profession no one wanted to exist. We'll also look at real individuals, some recorded by name, who became legends in their villages. So, take a breath. Top up your tea or whatever passes for medieval ale in your cup tonight. Because next, we're meeting the most famous sin eater of them all, and following him through the final century of the trade. Hey again, still awake? Good. If not, that's fine. This is one of those stories that sounds better half-dreamed anyway. We're staying in that same damp corner of Britain tonight, where the hills are soft, the sheep outnumber people, and theology gets filtered through pub gossip. And it's there, in the 17th century, that we meet one of the last men to make a living by eating the dead. His name, depending on which chronicle you believe, was Richard Munslow. The curious case of Richard Munslow. Richard lived in a little Shropshire village called Ratlinghope, which already sounds like a place haunted by mold and ancestral guilt. He wasn't your typical sin eater, though. Most were dirt poor, but Munslow was, well, a respectable farmer. He even had decent clothes, by which I mean 2 shirts. So why would a fairly comfortable man take up the most cursed job in Christendom? The story goes that he lost several children to illness, and in his grief, he turned to an old village tradition, one that might bring their souls peace. He became a sin eater not for money, but for meaning. Of course, that's folklore. But it fits, because sin eating was never just about superstition, it was about control. When the world falls apart, and faith feels like bureaucracy, you find rituals that make sense to you, even if everyone else thinks you've lost it. So Richard Munslow started performing the rite for others. Not often, maybe a few times a year, but enough that when he died in 1906, newspapers actually wrote about him as the last of the sin eaters. They said he'd absorbed the sins of many, which sounds impressive, until you remember it basically means ate a lot of funeral bread. Still, he's remembered today as the profession's final echo. The village even restored his gravestone in 2010, which is kind of ironic, honoring the man whose whole job was taking honor away from the dead, what it meant to eat a sin. Let's pause a second on the symbolism. The idea of eating sin sounds bizarre, but it's not that far from official religious language. Communion, the Eucharist, is itself about consuming something sacred to remove guilt. The difference is that, in church, it's God doing the heavy lifting. With sin eating, it's just Dave from down the lane, who hasn't bathed since Candlemas. Still, the gesture carried emotional weight. For the mourners, watching someone take that bite was cathartic, a visual reassurance that their loved one was forgiven. It turned abstract theology into something tangible, and tangibility is powerful when you can't read Latin and life expectancy is 42. The sin eater's diet of doom now. Not every sin eating involved simple bread. Regional variations added flavor, so to speak. In some places, they used funeral cakes, small, sweet loaves baked with symbolic crosses. In others, just salt, the purifier of the ancient world, and sometimes a sip of ale. Because of course, there's one account from Herefordshire where the sin eater insisted on a 6-penny loaf, a flagon of ale and 6 pence in coin. Honestly, not bad for 10 minutes of work and eternal damnation. That's about the medieval equivalent of a decent Uber Eats tip. But the ritual wasn't just consumption. It was theater. People believed the sins moved from the corpse to the food. So you had to eat solemnly, no crumbs, no jokes. You didn't want to drop anyone's wrath of envy onto the floorboards. And after it was done, the sin eater would walk away without looking back, because turning around might let the spirit follow you home. Which, fair living with other people's ghosts, imagine carrying that burden psychologically. You're told you hold the weight of dozens of souls. Every cough, every nightmare, every bit of bad luck. You start wondering which sin is leaking out of you. It's no surprise sin eaters often lived as hermits. Few friends, no church attendance. Always the last to be served ale at the inn, and maybe the first to be blamed when a cow died mysteriously. They weren't witches, but they filled a similar niche in village imagination. Half sacred, half contaminated. And yet, when the next death came, everyone knocked on their door again. It's the same pattern humanity always follows. We reject what we need, until we need it again. Folklore echoes and literary guests. By the 1800s, sin eaters had slipped from reality into folklore. Writers like Robert Stephen Hawker, an eccentric Cornish vicar who wore bright blue robes and talked to birds, as one does, claimed to have witnessed one. He described a man who ate the sins of the dead at their door. Hawker, of course, couldn't resist making it poetic. He imagined the sin eater as a Christ-like figure, sacrificing himself over and over, but without the resurrection clause. Later, authors picked up the image, from 19th century romantic poets to 20th century horror writers. By then, the sin eater had become a metaphor for anyone who absorbs others' guilt. Priests, therapists, even soldiers. The act lived on, even as the job died. The church's quiet victory. Meanwhile, organized religion congratulated itself for finally stamping out superstition. Sin-eating faded, replaced by formal last rites and tidy funeral liturgies, which sure were more theologically sound, but maybe a little less personal. There's something about an old man in muddy boots muttering over a body that feels more real, like the human version of faith before it got polished. And that's what fascinates folklorists today. That raw intersection between belief and survival. Sin-eating wasn't doctrine. It was desperation wrapped in ritual. And honestly, that's half of human history. A bread-sized window into poverty. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. For most sin-eaters, it wasn't about mystical calling. It was about hunger. Bread was bread. If you could feed your family by pretending to absorb your neighbor's wrath, you'd probably do it too. The economy of rural Britain didn't leave many options. Day laborers, shepherds, seasonal workers, all one bad harvest away from starvation. So if death offered a side gig, you took it. The afterlife was someone else's problem. Some local officials even looked the other way because it kept poor men employed, a grim version of social welfare. Sin-eating, in that sense, was both spiritual and economic recycling. The strange parallels. Elsewhere, what's interesting is that other cultures had similar figures. All unofficial, all unclean. In parts of India, certain castes handled the bodies of the dead and were considered ritually polluted. In Japan, there were the Ita, outcast barakamen who worked in death-related trades. In Central Europe, corpse washers faced similar stigma. Humanity has a pattern. When we can't bear the dirt of death, we pay someone else to touch it. Then we pretend we're pure. It's practical. It's cruel, and it never really changes. What it says about us when you step back from the superstition, sin-eating becomes a mirror. It shows how deeply people fear not just death, but unfinished business. We don't want to leave behind a moral mess, so we invent someone to tidy it up. The sin-eater was a living confessional booth, just with worse lighting and fewer Latin prayers. And for centuries, he played that role quietly, without complaint. Because honestly, complaining would only make people remember you existed. The gentle disappearance. By the time Richard Munslow died, the practice was more memory than ritual. Industrialization brought cemeteries, undertakers, and a sense that religion belonged indoors. The intimate, home-based death culture of the countryside vanished. People stopped laying out bodies on tables. They called the doctor instead of the sin-eater. Candles gave way to gaslight, then electricity. And with each bright bulb, another shadowy trade disappeared. But folklore is stubborn. Stories of sin-eaters lingered in ghost tales and local legends. Children whispered that if you left bread on a windowsill overnight, a sin-eater would come for it. Invisible, still hungry. Admittedly, that might just have been an excuse for why the bread went missing. Foxes have no respect for spiritual metaphors. From sin-eaters to modern guilt-eaters, the term even survived metaphorically. Today, sin-eater sometimes describes corporate whistleblowers, secret keepers, or people who take the blame to protect others. The concept mutated, but the DNA's the same. We still have an instinct to dump guilt somewhere else, to offload the emotional trash. It's why we confess, vent, apologize, or post online essays titled, My Accountability Statement. We're all looking for someone to nod solemnly, take a symbolic bite, and make it go away. So in a strange way, sin-eating never died. It just put on a suit and got a LinkedIn profile. The imagined Last Supper. Let's drift back one more time to that candlelit cottage. A body on the table, a loaf of bread beside it. The air thick with grief and ale fumes. The sin-eater steps in quietly, removes his hat, and whispers the words he's said 100 times. He eats, slowly, everyone watches. No one breathes. And in that moment, ridiculous, haunting, tender, an entire community exhales. They know it's not official. They know it's not rational, but it feels right. And sometimes, that's all humans really need. He wipes his hands, takes the coins, and leaves. No applause, no thanks. Just the sound of rain on a thatched roof and another name added to his invisible ledger of souls. The resting place of the last sin-eater today. If you visit the churchyard in Rattling Hope, you can still find Richard Munslow's grave. The inscription is plain. No hint that this was the man who symbolically digested half the county's moral failings. People leave coins and small loaves there now, a quiet gesture. Not because they believe, but because they like the story. It's comforting, in a weird way, to think someone once carried our sins for us, even if only for a slice of bread. And maybe that's the final irony. The sin-eater, rejected in life, became beloved in memory. We always do that. Love the ghosts of things we once despised. Floating toward the end. So, as you drift off, maybe think of those old villages, where faith and fear blurred together, where salvation cost 6 pence and a beer, and where one tired man in muddy boots made sure no soul was left unspoken for. History tends to remember kings and conquerors, but sometimes it's the quiet, anonymous people who held the world together in their strange, messy way. Sin-eaters didn't shape empires. They didn't write laws, but they gave peace, real or imagined, to those who needed it, and for that, I think they deserve a little sleep too. Hey, you're still here. That's good. By now the tea's probably cold and the cat's asleep on your foot. Perfect conditions to talk about Victorians and their favorite hobby. Turning every tragic peasant custom into sentimental poetry. The Victorians discovered the sin-eater by the mid-1800s. Britain was busy industrializing, colonizing, and inventing new ways to feel nostalgic about the rural past it was actively destroying. Folklorists wandered through villages collecting old customs, preferably ones involving candles, corpses, or moral ambiguity. And so the sin-eater re-emerged, not as a living worker, but as a quaint curiosity. You can picture it. A gentleman scholar in a tweed coat, notebook in hand, asking a bewildered farmer, "So, did anyone around here ever eat sins?" And the farmer, probably trying to finish his pint, says, "Aye, there was old Tom. Ate bread at funerals." The scholar beams. Another ancient rite discovered. Of course, most of these accounts were half memory, half embellishment. But they painted the sin-eater as a tragic relic of primitive superstition, which, to a Victorian, was a compliment. Folklore. With a moral lesson, the story fit perfectly into the moral tone of the time. The sin-eater became a symbol of misguided faith, a warning about what happens when common folk meddle in theology without clergy supervision. Newspapers ran human interest pieces titled things like "A Curious Relic of Heathen Wales," because nothing says journalism like patronizing adjectives. Yet readers were fascinated. It scratched that Gothic itch, the shiver of rural gloom, without having to leave London. By the fireplace, they could imagine the lonely figure trudging through the rain to perform his unholy supper. Safe, sanitized melancholy. Just how the Victorians liked it. Sin-eating meets anthropology. Meanwhile, anthropology was becoming a real academic discipline, and scholars needed exotic parallels for every European oddity. So sin-eating was promptly compared to Aztec blood rites, Hindu purification feasts, and biblical scapegoats. Because if you can connect a Welsh farmer to Leviticus, you get tenure. One 19th century ethnographer even claimed sin-eating proved the universal human instinct toward vicarious atonement, which is a fancy way of saying people everywhere like someone else to take the blame. A sound observation, honestly. A tiny revival in print literature loved it. Short stories popped up with titles like The Sin-Eater's Last Supper or The Bread of Absolution. Usually the plot went like this. Poor man eats sins, feels cursed, dies tragically. Moral achieved. Poets romanticized him as a Christ figure without disciples, wandering the misty moors. Painters illustrated gaunt men beside coffins, candlelight glinting off cheap pewter mugs. No one painted the part where he asked to be paid in coin and beer. From folklore to funeral etiquette. Curiously, some Victorian funeral customs echoed the logic of sin-eating, even if they'd never heard of it. Mourners covered mirrors, stopped clocks, and served funeral biscuits embossed with the deceased's initials. Little edible memorials. Eating remembrance was respectable again, as long as you didn't call it sin. In Scotland, there were still dirge cakes passed around after burials. In parts of Ireland, whiskey toast served the same purpose. Drink, forget, move on. So maybe sin-eating never really ended. It just got dressed up for polite society. Psychology sneaks. By the early 1900s, psychology began nibbling at religion's leftovers. Freud and friends talked about guilt, repression, and projection. Suddenly, sin-eating looked like a collective coping mechanism. Communities externalizing guilt onto one convenient scapegoat. From that angle, the sin-eater was basically an unpaid therapist with worse working conditions. He listened silently, absorbed collective anxiety, and carried it away. Primitive? Maybe. Effective? Possibly. Because confession isn't about metaphysics. It's about storytelling. You name the bad thing, watch someone acknowledge it, and then you can sleep. Bread, words, doesn't matter. The ritual is the medicine. Modern parallels because history never dies, fast forward to now. We still have sin eaters. We've just rebranded them. There are corporate fall guys, political aides who resign for the boss's mistakes, PR teams who accept full responsibility, while the CEO plays golf. There are therapists absorbing trauma, moderators filtering online misery, and customer service reps apologizing for problems they didn't cause. Different uniform, same function, absorbing collective guilt so the system keeps running. We outsource remorse. Always have. Colonial twists on the theme the British, ever eager to moralize abroad, even exported the metaphor. Missionaries, in the 19th century, described non-Christian rituals through a sin-eater lens. Anything involving food and purification became a heathen form of sin-eating. It was their way of making sense of difference by turning it into something familiar and mildly heretical. Ironically, those same missionaries encouraged symbolic eating in communion services. Consistency wasn't exactly the empire's strong suit. The academic autopsy by the mid-20th century, sin eating was a neat footnote in folklore journals. Anthropologists debated whether it was pre-Christian Celtic, early Christian improvisation, or just rural improvisation during the Reformation. Consensus: unclear, but very interesting. Academics adore unclear things. You can publish endlessly on them. But what everyone agreed on was the emotional logic. Sin eating worked because it felt like closure. Theology rarely comforts. Bread does. Hollywood's mild obsession inevitably, film and television got involved. Every few decades, someone makes a moody thriller titled The Sin Eater or The Order. Usually there's Latin chanting, secret societies, and vaguely glowing eyes, none of which ever happened in Shropshire, unless the cider was exceptionally strong. But that's the modern cycle. Turn folklore into fantasy, then wonder why it feels fake. The real Sin Eater's world was smaller, colder, and infinitely more human. No cloaks, no demons, just muddy shoes and grief. What it teaches about death. Culture at its heart, sin-eating belonged to a broader medieval intimacy with death. People washed corpses at home, touched them, prayed beside them. Death wasn't hidden, it was furniture. We've since outsourced that too. To hospitals, mortuaries, professionals in latex gloves. Cleaner, yes, but maybe lonelier. The Sin Eater's ritual reminds us that dying used to be a community affair. Messy, participatory, oddly comforting. Someone was there to take responsibility, even if symbolically. Now, we just sign forms. The slow fade into symbol by the late 20th century. The phrase Sin Eater survived mainly in novels, heavy metal lyrics, and obscure pub names. Folklorists kept it alive in local heritage pamphlets, right next to traditional cheese rolling. Because nothing says continuity like putting damnation between dairy festivals. But the metaphor stuck. Writers use it whenever they need a tragic archetype, the person who carries everyone else's pain. It's gloomy, marketable, and instantly understood. Why the image persists? Maybe because it taps into a universal fantasy, that guilt can be transferred like a virus, that someone, somewhere, can swallow your worst moments so you don't have to remember them. Confession, therapy, apology tours, they all trace that same wish, and maybe because we secretly like the balance. If sins can be eaten, they can be digested. Gone. Finished. The spiritual equivalent of composting. It's oddly comforting to think even morality obeys the laws of metabolism, the real weight of it, but behind the metaphor is something quieter. Loneliness. The Sin Eater wasn't just burdened by others' sins. He was excluded by them. Every meal made him a little less human in the eyes of his neighbors. And that's the melancholy center of the story. He helped everyone find peace, but no one wanted to sit beside him afterward. Classic human behavior. Gratitude with a side of revulsion. It's the same mechanism behind many outcast professions. Executioners, gravediggers, undertakers. Necessary but untouchable. We create impurity so we can feel pure. The last flicker of the tradition. Even today, a few folkloric ceremonies in Wales and the border counties nod to the old custom. Not real sin-eating, just reenactments. Someone in costume eating symbolic bread at a heritage festival while tourists film on their phones. History turned into performance art, with souvenir scones afterward. And maybe that's the gentlest ending the practice could have hoped for. To survive not as terror, but as theater. A story retold rather than a stigma lived, the quiet moral. If there has to be one, when you strip away the odd details. Bread on corpses, whispered rhymes, theological confusion. What's left is a very ordinary truth. People need to believe their mistakes can be undone. Whether through prayer, therapy, or carbs. The Sin Eater just made that belief visible. He performed what everyone wanted to imagine. That guilt has weight, and that weight can be carried away. It's not so different from lighting a candle, or saying sorry, just more chewy. Let's drift to the present. So here we are, centuries later, sitting in climate-controlled rooms, telling the story into microphones and earbuds. We think we're modern, but we still crave the same release. We post confessions online, and strangers click like, digital absolution. Tiny modern sin eaters in every comment section. Maybe that's progress. Or maybe it's just the same ritual, rendered in pixels instead of crumbs. The soft ending, imagine, if you will, that last anonymous sin eater somewhere in the hills around 1850. No newspaper article, no folklore collector, just a tired man finishing his work. He eats, nods, and walks home under a cloudy sky. The world around him is changing. Railways, telegrams, Sunday schools. But for one more night, the old belief still matters to someone. And then it fades. The rain keeps falling, the bread hardens, and another little superstition quietly slips into history's long sleep. So tonight, maybe let that image settle. A man, a loaf, a silence, humanity's oldest ingredients, guilt, hunger, hope. Hey again, you've made it to the quietest part. The world outside is probably half asleep by now. Dogs stopped barking, last bus is gone. Perfect time to talk about the afterlife of ideas that refuse to die. The loneliness of doing sacred work. There's a strange rule in history. The closer you get to the sacred, the lonelier the job. Priests, midwives, undertakers, sin eaters. All custodians of transition. They stand at the edges where everyone else looks away. It's an awkward place to live. The sin eater's loneliness wasn't heroic. It was the kind you don't notice until years later. When you realize no one waves back. He performed the only ritual that guaranteed his own exclusion. Everyone wanted his service. No one wanted his presence. And yet for some families, he might have been the only familiar face left at a deathbed. No priest would come. The parish refused burial rites. So the sin eater filled the gap. An unsanctioned priest for the unsanctioned dead. It's hard not to feel a little tenderness there. What they believed they were doing. Modern people like to assume superstition was always simple. But it wasn't. When a family hired a sin eater, they weren't stupid. They were scared. They believed in sin the way we believe in debt. Something measurable, transferable, with consequences. You could spend your whole life trying to pay it down through penance. But if death came early or confession was denied, you looked for shortcuts. Bread and prayer were a form of insurance, and maybe it even worked. Faith isn't about being right. It's about sleeping at night. If you felt forgiven, you were. Theology rarely gets simpler than that. The economics of guilt. There's another angle too. The class one. Sin-eating thrived among the poor because forgiveness cost money. Confession was technically free, but funeral masses weren't. If your family couldn't afford candles, bells, and the priest's dinner, you improvised. That's what most folk religion was. DIY spirituality. You took official doctrine, mixed it with old pagan logic, and made it practical. The church might frown, but hunger frowns harder. So yes, the sin-eater was a relic of theology, but also of economics. Wherever salvation had a price tag, someone eventually offered a cheaper version. The church's half-hearted crackdown. Officially, the church condemned the practice. Unofficially, it tolerated it in remote places, because the alternative was unrest. Rural priests were often too overworked to reach every dying soul. If a local man wanted to mumble over bread for a shilling, who was going to ride 50 miles to stop him? In that sense, the sin-eater wasn't rebellion. He was a practical compromise, a patch on a broken system of salvation. That's probably why the record fades rather than ends. No great confrontation, just gradual neglect. The curious comfort of physical rituals. Something else the sin-eater reminds us. People trust the tangible. Words help, but touch convinces. When you see someone eat your sins, you believe it's done. It's not rational, but neither is grief. That's why most religions lean on props. Candles, incense, beads, wine, wafers, all physical metaphors for invisible feelings. The sin-eater simply improvised his own props. Bread for burden, olive for absolution. In a way, it was good theater. And sometimes theater heals better than sermons. How modern rituals echo the old. We still perform tiny acts of symbolic transfer every day. Throw coins into fountains, burn photographs, delete messages. All small attempts to make guilt physical, so we can move it somewhere else. You could even call modern therapy a kind of sin eating. You tell someone your worst thoughts. They listen, absorb, and hand them back transformed. Except now, instead of a shilling, you pay by the hour. Progress, I guess. Memory as a kind of forgiveness. Let's drift for a moment into the idea of memory, because that's what we're really doing, keeping ghosts tidy. The Sin Eater's work didn't end with digestion. It ended with forgetting. He carried the burden so others could let it fade. History works the same way. We remember long enough to make sense, then we stop. If we remembered everything, we'd never move on. So maybe historians are the final Sin Eaters. We consume the past so others don't have to. Not as poetic, but close enough. The myth. After the man, every culture eventually mythologizes its unwanted truths. Executioners become tragic figures. Witches become symbols of feminism. And Sin Eaters, well, they become bedtime stories on YouTube. It's how we domesticate discomfort. By turning the outcast into metaphor, we let him back in. He's no longer dangerous. He's instructive. The irony, of course, is that the real man would have hated all this attention. He wanted coins, not legacy. But that's history's favorite trick, ignoring what people wanted and giving them immortality instead. Short detour through art again, painters still. Return to the image now and then. A dim figure bending over a coffin. Candlelight bread, maybe a crow outside. It's haunting because it feels unfinished. There's no triumph, no revelation, just duty. A man doing a job no one else would. Writers, too, love the concept. It shows up in everything from Gothic novels to urban fantasy. Sometimes the Sin Eater is supernatural, sometimes bureaucratic, sometimes metaphorical. Always alone. Apparently we can't resist that combination. Isolation plus redemption. It's our favorite flavor of melancholy. What we project onto him. The Sin Eater means different things depending on who's looking. To theologians, heresy. To folklorists, a curiosity. To poets, a martyr. To us, maybe a mirror. Because who hasn't quietly hoped that someone else would take the weight for a mistake? A parent, a friend, a stranger on the internet saying you're forgiven. We all want an external conscience sometimes. The Sin Eater just happened to make that literal. The biology of belief, there's even a neurological angle. Anthropologists have noted that rituals involving touch and ingestion trigger strong placebo effects, calming heart rate, reducing anxiety. When someone consumes symbolic food in your name, your body literally relaxed. You could measure it. So in a sense, the Sin Eater did absolve sins by lowering cortisol. Faith, chemistry, doesn't matter which. Peace is peace. The last documented one of the final mentions comes from the late 1800s. A man in the Welsh borders, described as old, shabby, and half-mad from drink. He was called only the last Sin Eater. He died alone. No one performed the ritual for him. There's poetic justice in that. Or maybe just sadness. Either way, the tradition folded inward, self-consumed, like the bread it used. What remains in language oddly, the phrase, to eat one's sins, still appears now and then in English poetry. Usually it means self-forgiveness, swallowing your own mistakes and moving on, which might be the healthiest form of the practice yet. No need for bread, just a little grace. A gentle modern reflection, if you strip the story to its bones. It's about compassion disguised as superstition. Someone volunteered to bear what others couldn't face. Primitive, yes, but also profoundly kind. He wasn't trying to play God. He was filling a hole in human need. We still need those people. Listeners, mediators, quiet cleaners of emotional mess. Most of them never get statues either. So maybe when you hear the term Sin Eater, don't imagine doom and gloom. Imagine the small kindness of letting others sleep easier. That's not dark magic. That's empathy. Why we tell the story at all? Because every society invents ways to live with guilt. The interesting part isn't the ritual itself. It's that someone thought to invent it. It tells us that even in centuries we call dark, people were creatively trying to be good. That's something worth remembering. And in a broader sense, it's a reminder that belief systems aren't fossilized. They're adaptive. When institutions fail, humans improvise forgiveness. With or without permission. The slow fade. Out, so if you're still awake, congratulations. You've outlasted 700 years of superstition. You can almost see the candlelight flicker over those old hills. The bread resting on a plate. The quiet shuffle of someone doing what needs to be done. No glory, no hymns. Just one man and a very peculiar kind of mercy. And now the world has changed enough that we can talk about it without fear. Maybe even with a little gratitude. Because in his strange way, the Sin Eater kept communities from falling apart under guilt. That's a kind of holiness no theology can define. Final drift. So tonight, when you close your eyes, think of that ordinary ritual and the calm behind it. A world without microphones or screens, where forgiveness was baked, not spoken. Simple, awkward, human. The bread's gone cold. The rain has stopped. And somewhere in the long archive of forgotten jobs, the Sin Eater finally rests. His work, quite literally, finished.